We decided to have this presentation with a spoken accompaniment, which is based on published scientific studies on biases. And you'll see throughout the talk some references. You also see some websites. So those of you who are interested, the references will be all listed on the last slide. And actually, this the slideshow is available on our website. So here's the definition, a scholarly definition of bias. Bias is a tendency, inclination, or prejudice toward or against something or someone. What we're concerned about, of course, some biases are very obvious, and some people have no compunction about even stating their bias, whether it's against women or against the political opposite or whatever. But what we're interested here is implicit and unconscious bias. So it's been clearly shown that we all categorize people, and once we've categorized people, we assign positive or negative values to these categories. And these biases become fixed in our thought processes and are accessed automatically and without our knowing it. Such biases develop from all sorts of sources, but definitely from our culture and our experiences, whether it's parents or teachers or friends. Very important are, of course, probably the most important, are peer groups, and that affects us here as well. Bias is not, a devil's property. It's very, very human. In fact, we need quick decisions, and we probably all have biases and have our blind spots. One interesting thing is that we do see biases much more in others than in ourselves. We think we're absolutely objective, which is why it's called unconscious bias. We can suppress our biases if we focus and concentrate, but once we get very tired or hungry or antsy or emotional in a row, out they all come without our even noticing it. What I want to do next is talk you through a set of biases. And actually this is important for a number of reasons. A, to remind ourselves, but it's also the fact that there have been clear studies that showed that simply talking about biases ahead of an assessment of, choice of people or grant allocations, etc., simply talking about it has been shown to reduce the bias in the ensuing discussion. So I'll talk about the biases one by one that are listed on this slide, and I'll start with affinity bias. Affinity bias is defined as an inclination to prefer people that are similar to ourselves or have something in common with ourselves or with somebody who matters much to ourselves. So in our context, there are many areas to which this applies. For instance, people who work in the same field as we do, people with similar educational background, been to the same college, ooh wow, similar career paths, taken time out in industry or whatever, or done 2 degrees. Cultural groups, of course, we feel more affinity to people in the same cultural group, even same accent. And then very much, of course, in the grants we review the research topics or the approaches we take. So apart from these biases reducing objectivity and fairness, they of course also limit innovation, diversity, and creativity. One tends to end up with a more of the same culture, which is the exact opposite of what we want, of course, at the ERC. Attribution bias is the next slide, is defined as a self-serving tendency to attribute one's own successes to one's own intelligence and personality and talents, but one's failures to the situation and to external factors and to bad luck. And what follows from that is also that one tends to interpret others' successes to situational or external factors. That little website down there is called Did This Really Happen? And this is a set of comics that were set up by an ERC research team in 2017. And they're about sexism as one of the biases, and they're based on real testimonies submitted by members of our research community. One example is a woman who'd published a paper in Nature, was very proud. She'd even got the title page, and she went to the lab and said, yes, accepted, we got the title page, really great. Told her lab, told her colleagues, and some celebrated and congratulated, and one said, yeah. So the editorial panel at Nature, they have a lot of women on it, don't they? So, which is outrageous. So they blamed it on the women selecting the woman for a cover page, and which is, of course, not true. Okay, Magdalena Skipper, the editor-in-chief of Nature, is a woman, but that part isn't true, and it's a clear case of it's not her achievement, it's the situation. So do look out for that. I know you won't do anything as crass as that, but it's a real story. Confirmation bias. So once we have an opinion, we of course have a tendency to seek out information that confirms that opinion and unconsciously ignore evidence that opposes our opinion. So this happens in panels for sure. So I think we sometimes recognize, but maybe not always, that we're more likely to listen to external reviews that confirm what we thought from our reading of the grant than to those who oppose it. Similarly, in the panel, if somebody agrees with us, we pay more attention to what they say than somebody who comes, who questions and probes and opposes us. So it's really important to listen to other panel members who disagree and go through the arguments they bring. So it's important to pause and think before quickly approving, and ask yourself whether you're giving all the external opinions the weight they're due. Next one is conformity bias. This is caused by peer group pressure, which is of course very strong in research. And often in these panels, individuals who feel that most of the group is leaning towards or away from a certain position may decide to go along with that position and what the group thinks, rather than voicing their own views, which run counter to that view. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie 12 Angry Men. Who has? Okay, less than half. The other half, you must see it. It's a fantastic movie. It's about a jury who has to judge on a murder case, and the indications are all so clear. I mean, it's that guy, he was there, etc. He hated the person. Everything is clear. So everybody says guilty, guilty, guilty. Round comes to Henry Fonda. He also thinks they're guilty, but he thinks, this can't be. We at least have to discuss it. So he comes up with a reason, and then the movie is about the rest of the movie, and they end up with a not guilty. So please be Henry Fonda, even when everybody else in the room is clearly right about what they think and you think may be wrong. And everybody else in the room, please listen to Henry Fonda. Now, halo and horns effects. This is a term that's used to state that if one likes one characteristic of an individual, one may have more positive view of all the other characteristics, and everything you've just heard applies in force then, and the converse is also true. So this can be particularly important in the interviews. So you see the candidate, you form an immediate opinion often, either because of the way they speak or because you like their hairdo or whatever, trivial things which don't matter, but they nudge you into one direction. And if that happens, you can get swayed and overlook shortcomings, or you can extrapolate your positive perception and, it's the other way around. Whichever, it can go both ways. So if a candidate represents themselves in a manner that you don't like, then you may also not like their answers as much. I want to go through some specific examples, just to remind you to watch out for these. They're from the literature, and I think the literature is cited. So, first one is gender. Of course, we're very happy that our panels are now really have a much better gender balance. We're also happy that we're seeing more applications from women. There is, nevertheless, there continues to be gender bias in the evaluations, and here are a few examples. So, when it comes to independence of the researcher, the role and independence of women is more often questioned, and in ways that do not apply to men to the same extent. An example of collaborations and private relationships which occur and can occur if they're declared. If such relationships are seen in women's applications, they're much more often questioned than when they are in men's. And even when it's about using positive terms, for some reason the descriptors for men and for women that are used in panels are different. So look out for that. I'm sure you do, but do remind yourselves that even if you think you're being fair, have to pay attention to it every time. This is an interesting study that shows who's listened to in a panel. Well, if there's an expert in the field, and we all have experts in the fields in our panel, that person isn't always listened to all the time, 100% of the time, but at least the majority. So 60% of the time, their opinion will be followed. If their opinion isn't followed, who then is listened to? Well, guess what? The person in the panel who is loudest, who shouts most. This is not anecdotal, this is a clear study. So the person who takes most airtime tends to have the strongest influence, and airtime is therefore is a stronger indicator of perceived influence than for expertise. This has been shown. So remember that, just because somebody talks more than everyone else, somebody is more extroverted than everyone else, doesn't mean they should be listened to more than everyone else. Now, two studies that are really quite depressing. This one is about judging manuscripts, and this was an experiment where 3 groups of reviewers got the same papers and were asked to accept or reject the paper. And one group was given the paper with the name of the author of a prominent researcher, one was anonymized, and one had a little-known author. And you see the effects. The prominent researcher was, for the same paper, was 3 times as likely to be accepted than the little-known author. So that's why I would have preferred to leave the PIs out altogether from the start and only really look at them at the very end. But please keep this in mind when you look at people. The next one is a similar study. This one comes from Australia, and it's about job applications. 2 groups were given identical sets. In one, the application came from someone with an English-sounding name, and in the other, they came with a non-English sounding name, indigenous names or foreign names, or others that were not your average sort of Anglo-Saxon names. And again, you see the results. The ones with English names were 2.5 times as likely to be invited for a job interview than the ones with the other names. Really terrible. And you can say that's job applications, wouldn't happen to us, but the previous was scientific papers, and it did happen to us. So please don't let it happen to you. Okay, just to summarize, know your unconscious biases. Those of you who've not done the implicit bias test that Harvard has, you can just Google it or memorize this URL. It's fun. Do it. When it comes to your evaluations, phrase clear criteria and be accountable for opinions. That really reduces bias. In the room, Build a challenge culture. So have a devil's advocate. Go for nonconformism. Pay attention to airtime. Nudge people or tug their sleeves, or if your sleeve is tugged or you are nudged for talking too much, don't get angry with them, remind yourself. Chairs, please make sure that everybody has the opportunity to contribute, but it's the whole panel that has to develop that culture. So that's where I thank you. The last slide shows only the references, and you can't read them, you're not supposed to read them, but if you want them, the talk is online, and I'll now be happy to take your questions.